The wind howled through the dense pine forest surrounding Fort Branson, carrying with it the distant echoes of a storm brewing on the horizon. The training fields, usually alive with the disciplined precision of military drills, now stood eerily silent. Somewhere beyond the towering gates, Maximus, a highly trained German shepherd, had vanished. Sergeant Jack Callahan, standing near the edge of the facility's perimeter, clenched his jaw as he listened to the frantic reports crackling over the radio. The unit had just finished an advanced tactical training session when the alarms had been triggered. One of their most elite military working dogs was missing. Not just any dog, his dog. The one that had saved his life more times than he could count. How the hell does a dog like Maximus just disappear? Callahan muttered under his breath, his fingers tightening around the leash still clipped to his belt, the leash that should have been attached to Maximus. A search was launched immediately, but no trace of the German Shepherd was found. No broken fence, no signs of struggle, no footprints leading away from the facility. It was as if he had simply been erased from existence. Days turned into weeks, then months. Callahan refused to give up, following every lead, every whispered rumor of stolen military dogs showing up in underground fighting circuits. But it wasn't until 14 months later, in a place far removed from the rigid order of Fort Branson, that he finally found his answer. On the outskirts of Blackwood County, hidden behind the decayed remains of an old warehouse, a different kind of operation thrived. One built on blood, pain, and brutality. The air was thick with the acrid stench of unwashed fur and fear, mingling with the distant cheers of gamblers eager for a night of carnage. Inside one of the rusted kennels, shoved into a shadowed corner like discarded trash, lay Maximus. His once proud frame had withered, his ribs pressing against his dull coat. Scars crisscrossed his body, each one a testament to the suffering he had endured. But what made Callahan's breath hitch wasn't the physical damage, it was the look in Maximus's eyes. They weren't lifeless, as expected of a dog broken by cruelty. No, deep within the amber depths still flickered something dangerous, defiance. And that, Callahan knew, was the very thing that would save them both. The first lash of the whip cut through the stagnant air like a gunshot, its leather snapping against raw, scarred flesh. Maximus didn't flinch. He had learned through months of agony that showing pain only fueled the monster holding the whip. Grant Nolan, the man who had stolen him from the only life he had ever known, sneered in frustration. He loomed over the battered German shepherd, sweat dripping from his temple despite the cool night air. His patience was wearing thin. "You stubborn son of a..." Nolan spat, gripping the handle of the whip so tightly his knuckles turned white. "You either fight or you die." Maximus held his ground. Even as the whip came down again, searing another stripe of pain across his back, his golden eyes never wavered. He would not break. For 14 months he had endured this hell. Starvation, isolation, pain. He had been forced into the ring countless times, thrown against other desperate creatures, their eyes wild with terror. He had seen what became of the ones who fought back. The crowd would roar, bets would be placed, and when the bloodlust had been satisfied, the loser, whether man or beast, was discarded like a broken tool. Maximus had refused. Even when hunger gnawed at his insides, even when exhaustion threatened to pull him under, he had never given in. He had not forgotten his training. He was not a mindless killer. But Nolan was running out of patience. "Fine," the man growled, tossing the whip aside. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something worse, a cattle prod. The electric hum filled the cramped space of the makeshift kennel, and for the first time, Maximus' body tensed. Nolan noticed. He grinned. "Ah, so you do remember what pain feels like," he murmured, stepping forward. "Let's see if this jogs your memory some more." The prod made contact, and Maximus's world exploded in agony. His muscles locked, a violent tremor ripping through his frame as volts of electricity surged through his body. His legs buckled, but he refused to fall. Nolan laughed. "You're strong, I'll give you that," he said, rolling his shoulders. "But even the strongest break eventually." As the pain faded, Maximus raised his head, locking eyes with the man who had stolen everything from him. Nolan didn't see fear. He saw something far worse. A warrior who had not yet surrendered. The rain came down in sheets, drumming against the rusted tin roofs of the dogfighting compound. The air was thick with the stench of wet fur, blood, and decay. Jack Callahan stood just beyond the perimeter, his heart pounding like a war drum in his chest. He had followed every lead, turned over every stone, chased rumors across 3 states, and now, finally, he was here. His gaze swept across the row of makeshift kennels, little more than rusted metal and filth. Then he saw him, Maximus. Callahan's breath caught in his throat. The dog he had spent 14 months searching for lay curled in the farthest corner of the cage, his once magnificent frame reduced to nothing but skin and bone. His coat, once gleaming with health, was now matted and dull, marked with the cruel scars of whips and worse. His ears, always alert and proud, were flattened against his skull. For a moment, Callahan felt paralyzed, rage, sorrow, and guilt warring within him. How had it come to this? How had a soldier, a warrior, been reduced to this broken creature before him? The sound of heavy boots on wet gravel snapped Callahan back to the present. Grant Nolan was coming. The fight promoter strode toward Maximus's cage, a sneer twisting his scarred face. In his hand, he carried the cattle prod, the same one he had used to break countless animals before. "You're up next, Mutt," Nolan muttered, unlocking the kennel gate. Maximus didn't move. He had learned to conserve his energy, to wait. But then something shifted. His body tensed, his ears flicked. He had sensed something. Nolan didn't notice. He was too focused on his frustration, too focused on his failure to turn this dog into a mindless killer. He grabbed Maximus's collar, ready to drag him out. That's when Maximus's gaze lifted and met Callahan's. For a single, breathless second, the world stopped. The dog's eyes, dulled by suffering, suddenly came alive. Recognition sparked, flickering through the darkness like a dying ember catching flame. His ears pricked forward, muscles coiling beneath his battered frame. He knew, and so did Callahan. Without hesitation, Callahan stepped forward, his voice cutting through the storm. "Get your damn hands off my dog." Nolan whirled around, his grip tightening on the cattle prod, confusion flickering across his face, but he was already too late. Maximus had risen. Nolan's fingers tightened around the cattle prod, his mind racing. This wasn't part of the plan. The dog was supposed to be broken. Nothing more than a battered, lifeless shell that moved when commanded and fought when forced. But now, standing before him, Maximus was anything but broken. A deep, guttural growl rumbled from the German shepherd's chest, raw and primal. His ears were erect, eyes locked onto his captor with an intensity that sent a chill through the air. His body, despite the months of starvation and abuse, coiled with lethal precision. Nolan took a step back. "Stay down, Mutt," he snarled, pressing the cattle prod's trigger. The tip crackled with electricity, blue light illuminating the darkness of the kennel. Maximus didn't flinch. Callahan took another step forward, his voice low but steeped in command. "You made a mistake, Nolan," he said, eyes never leaving the man. "You stole from the wrong people." Nolan scoffed, though his grip on the prod was anything but steady. "This isn't your military, old man," he spat. "Out here, I make the rules." Callahan's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Then let's see how you handle a real fight." Nolan lunged first, thrusting the prod toward Callahan's torso, but the veteran was faster. A sidestep, a swift twist of the wrist, and Nolan's arm was wrenched backward, sending the weapon clattering into the mud. Maximus moved at that exact moment. It wasn't the chaotic, frenzied attack of a street dog. It was calculated, precise, military. With a surge of power, the German shepherd slammed into the kennel gate, his weight breaking the rusted latch free. The door swung open, and in an instant, Maximus was airborne. Nolan barely had time to raise his hands before 60 pounds of muscle and fury crashed into him, knocking him onto his back. The impact stole the breath from his lungs, but worse was the sensation of teeth locking firmly around his forearm, restraining, not maiming. Maximus had him. The German shepherd held the bite, his jaw clamped with a control that was both terrifying and absolute. He could tear through muscle and bone if he wanted to, but he didn't. Callahan crouched beside Nolan, his voice calm and steady. "That," he said, nodding toward Maximus, "is the difference between a fighter and a killer." And for the first time that night, Nolan understood. He had never broken Maximus. He had only made him stronger. The wail of sirens split through the rain-drenched night, flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the rusted metal of the compound. Blackwood County Sheriff's Department, federal agents, tactical units. They came in force, boots pounding against the mud, weapons drawn as they surrounded the illicit dogfighting ring. Nolan, still pinned beneath Maximus's unyielding grip, struggled against the pressure, but knew it was over. "Grant Nolan!" A voice boomed over the chaos, an authoritative command cutting through the night. "You're under arrest for animal cruelty, illegal gambling, and operating an underground dogfighting ring. Do not move." Callahan finally gave the command. "Release." Maximus hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, before obeying, his training overriding his instincts. He backed away, his chest rising and falling with deep, controlled breaths. He had done his job. He had won. Two officers stormed forward, wrenching Nolan's arms behind his back as they slapped handcuffs around his wrists. His once cocky sneer had vanished, replaced by a mask of cold resignation. "You think this stops anything?" Nolan growled, his lips split, his pride wounded more than his body. "I'm just one piece of the game." Callahan took a slow step forward, his eyes hard. "Then we'll tear the whole thing down." And they did. As Nolan was dragged away, federal agents swarmed the compound. Doors were kicked open, files were pulled from cabinets. Evidence, mountains of it, lay scattered across the dimly lit back rooms of the fight house. Betting records, financial logs, shipment lists, and most damning of all, a ledger filled with military identification numbers. Callahan's stomach twisted. Maximus hadn't been the only one. An agent, a woman in an FBI vest with a sharp, no-nonsense demeanor, held up a thick folder. "This isn't just dogfighting," she said grimly, flipping through the pages. "This is military-grade theft." Inside the folder were names, numbers, identities of dozens of missing military working dogs. Some listed as sold, others as deceased. One name, scrawled hastily at the bottom, stood out like a bullet wound. Ethan Grayson, a former Fort Branson contractor, the man who had stolen Maximus. And if the evidence was right, he had been doing it for years. Callahan exhaled slowly. The battle wasn't over, it was just beginning. The fluorescent lights of Dr. Elizabeth Harper's veterinary clinic buzzed softly, casting a sterile glow over the examination table where Maximus lay. His body, once a masterpiece of strength and discipline, was now a battlefield of scars. Each welt and burn told a story of suffering, of pain endured in silence. Jack Callahan stood at his side, fists clenched at his sides. He had seen men torn apart by war, soldiers who returned from battle with wounds that ran deeper than flesh. But nothing had prepared him for this. For the first time in years, he felt powerless. Dr. Harper moved with a practiced efficiency, her touch gentle but firm as she ran her hands along Maximus's ribs, counting each one protruding through his dull coat. "Malnourished," she murmured, her voice clipped with barely concealed anger. "Lost at least 30% of his muscle mass. Multiple lacerations, some fresh, some weeks old. And these..." She traced a scar along his flank, eyes darkening. "These are burns. Cattle prod, most likely." Callahan forced himself to swallow the bile rising in his throat. He had suspected, but hearing it aloud made it real. Maximus barely reacted to the examination. His breathing was slow, controlled, too controlled. The same way Callahan had seen men react after being held captive, their bodies present, but their minds somewhere else, locked in a place where pain was expected. Dr. Harper straightened. "He'll recover physically. It'll take time, but with proper nutrition, medical care, and therapy, he'll rebuild his strength." She paused, meeting Callahan's gaze. "But that's not the real battle, is it?" No, it wasn't. Callahan had seen it the moment he walked into that compound. The way Maximus had hesitated before recognizing him, the way his tail had remained stiff, his body braced for another blow. "He doesn't trust people anymore," Callahan admitted, his voice rough. Dr. Harper nodded. "And after what he's been through, can you blame him?" Silence stretched between them, heavy with understanding. Then something shifted. A soft, barely audible sound. "A whine!" Callahan turned back to Maximus, watching as the German shepherd slowly, cautiously pressed his head against Callahan's hand. The touch was light, but it was there. A small victory, the first of many battles ahead. The early morning sun stretched across the rolling fields of Fort Bellevue, casting long shadows as Jack Callahan pulled his truck into the lot outside the Veteran Service Dog Training Center. He cut the engine, exhaled slowly, and turned toward the passenger seat. Maximus sat there, his golden eyes scanning the unfamiliar surroundings. He was stronger now, physically at least. The weeks at Dr. Harper's clinic had restored much of what had been lost. The sharpness in his gaze, the power beneath his frame. But Callahan knew the deeper wounds, the ones that didn't fade with food and medicine, were still there. "This is it, boy," Callahan murmured, reaching over to scratch behind Maximus's ear. The dog didn't flinch anymore at sudden movements, a sign of progress, but he still held himself with that quiet tension. Always assessing, always bracing. Callahan pushed open the door. Maximus followed, stepping onto solid ground with the precise movements of a soldier scanning a new battlefield. The facility director, Captain Lisa Martinez, was waiting. A former military handler herself, she carried the same presence Callahan did. Rigid, disciplined, but with the weight of someone who had seen too much. She eyed Maximus with a knowing look. "He's got the build of a warrior," she said, watching as the German shepherd's ears twitched at the distant sound of barking dogs in training. Callahan nodded. He was won. Now he needs a new fight. Martinez motioned for them to follow. "That's what we do here." The training grounds were a mix of open fields, obstacle courses, and controlled indoor environments designed to simulate real-world situations. But this wasn't about combat anymore. It was about transformation. As they walked, Callahan listened as Martinez explained the program. "We take military working dogs and retired service animals, those too wounded or traumatized to return to the field, and retrain them as therapy dogs for veterans with PTSD." She glanced at Callahan. "You'd be surprised how often the ones needing help are the handlers themselves." Callahan stiffened. He wasn't here for himself. Was he? Ahead, a veteran sat on a bench, a Labrador pressing its weight against his leg, offering silent comfort. Maximus watched, his ears pricked, his stance shifting. Recognition flickered in his eyes. Callahan saw it too. Maybe this wasn't just Maximus's second chance. Maybe it was his too. The courtroom was silent, thick with the weight of what had been revealed. Rows of spectators, military officials, law enforcement, and civilians alike, sat rigid, their faces drawn with quiet fury. Ethan Grayson, the man responsible for orchestrating the theft and torture of military working dogs, sat at the defense table, his posture stiff, his expression unreadable. But Jack Callahan could see the flicker of unease in his eyes. He should be afraid. Maximus sat at Callahan's side, his massive frame still, his ears erect, amber eyes locked on the man who had stolen 14 months of his life. The prosecutor stood, clearing his throat before turning toward the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice measured yet firm, "you have seen the evidence, the ledger, the betting slips, the forensic reports confirming that this man not only stole these highly trained military assets, but sold them into a world of blood sport and brutality." He gestured toward the screen behind him, where an image of Maximus, taken the night of his rescue, was displayed. The gasps in the room were almost simultaneous. The proud, disciplined warrior was unrecognizable. Ribs jutting through matted fur, scars layered upon scars, eyes filled with exhaustion, yet still burning with defiance. Callahan clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay present. The prosecutor continued, voice sharp as steel. "These animals are not just tools of war. They are soldiers. They serve with loyalty, courage, and discipline, and they deserve the same in return. What happened to Maximus and to others like him was not just cruelty, it was betrayal." He turned to Grayson, his gaze cold. "And today, justice is served." The verdict came swiftly. Guilty on all counts. A slow exhale left Callahan's lungs as the tension in the room broke. Maximus remained steady, his head lifting slightly as if he understood something had ended. But as Callahan ran a hand along the thick fur at his partner's neck, he knew this wasn't the end. Justice had been delivered, but healing was still a battlefield. Outside, the sun was high, the air crisp. As they stepped onto the courthouse steps, Maximus tilted his head toward Callahan, waiting for the next move. Callahan smirked. "Come on, buddy, we've got work to do." And together, they walked toward whatever came next. Maximus's story is not just one of survival. It is a testament to the unbreakable bond between man and animal, forged through trust, loyalty, and resilience. He was stolen, beaten, and forced into darkness, but his spirit was never broken. And when given the chance, he did not seek vengeance. He reclaimed his purpose. Too often, animals are treated as disposable, their lives reduced to profit, entertainment, or convenience. But they feel pain, they suffer, and they remember. Maximus endured unimaginable cruelty, yet with patience, love, and the right guidance, he found his way back, not just to life, but to purpose. This story is a call to action. Every animal deserves dignity. Whether it's a highly trained military dog or a stray on the street, their lives matter. They are not ours to exploit, to harm, or to discard when they are no longer useful. Maximus's journey proves that healing is possible, even after the worst kind of suffering. But it begins with us. It begins with choosing kindness, with standing against cruelty, and with recognizing that these incredible creatures give us far more than we could ever repay. Respect them, protect them, because in the end, they would do the same for us.